summit in Los Angeles perhaps should have been called the Summit of Some of the Americas. Mexico's President Andrés Manuel López Obrador skipped the meeting because the U.S. didn't invite leaders from Nicaragua, Venezuela, or Cuba. AMLO, as he's called, was sworn in 4 years ago as Mexico's first leftist president in almost three-quarters of a century. He's also a populist, and he's indicative of a leftist populist wave that seems to be riding through the region. Let me bring in Shannon O'Neill. She is the Senior Fellow for Latin American Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Describe the wave, because it's happening in Chile, it's happening in Mexico, it seems to be happening in Colombia, and then, of course, there's Brazil, largest country in Latin America. Why is it happening in all these places at the same time?
You know, as I look at these elections and the changes in power that we're seeing and who's coming in, I would describe it more as an anti-incumbent wave than necessarily a leftist wave. And what we are seeing all over Latin America is voters getting out and voting for the non-establishment, voting for the outsider. The pandemic hit this region harder than almost any other region in the world in terms of fatalities, in terms of the cost to the economies, to formal sector jobs and the like. So people are really living in a precarious situation. So they have looked for politicians, for candidates that have told them they're going to provide something different, that they're going to get away from the old system that is seen as corrupt, that hasn't fixed a lot of Latin America's problems. And so they're turning to these outsiders, these populists.
So when I look at a place like Chile, which was in many ways regarded as, the kind of poster child of Latin America, people describe it because of its fast growth rates. They would say Chile is an East Asian country that just happens to be in Latin America. Well, now it seems like it has a very left-wing government. And in fact, they're rewriting the constitution. And there are all kinds of plans that seem very, it seems to be very much a kind of left-wing constitution with a lot of progressive ideals written right into the Constitution. How big a shift is it in Chile?
Chile, I think, really is a bellwether here on what might happen in Latin America. There's a hopeful side to that, but then also a really cautionary tale. And so Boric, the new president of Chile, is in his 30s. He's a millennial, and he is from the progressive left. He believes in, broad social rights. He believes in environmental actions. But he also believes in democracy and working with democratic checks and balances in the Congress and like. He is working with the Constituent Assembly, which is forming this new constitution, and they are more to the left. In fact, almost all of the members are not traditional members of political parties. And so what we will see over the next couple of months, because they'll vote on this constitution in a referendum come the fall, is whether or not Chileans go for this constitution. Right now, it's a big question.
What about Brazil? Because there you have a situation where it seemed like there was a kind of Trump-like populist, Bolsonaro, and many of his, much of his appeal was sort of Trump-like. It was cultural issues. It was a lot of, the sense of resentment against the elites. But now he's very unpopular, and what's happened is you have a real old-fashioned left-wing populist, Lula, the former president, who seems to be roaring ahead in the polls. Is that a story of how in Latin America these cultural issues don't have as much traction, and that old-fashioned economic issues still do have a lot of traction?
I think that's right. And it is also, I think, very telling of this anti-incumbent wave. You're seeing voters turn to anybody but Bolsonaro, the current president. So you have this anti-incumbent. Strangely, the anti-incumbent is someone who spent their whole life in politics and actually has been president of Brazil before in the form of Lula. So it's less here, I think, about the policies that are laid out. And in many of these elections, there's very few policies actually being put on the table. It's more about someone who's coming in and promising to change things.
And that's why when you look at AMLO, López Obrador, who is, when you go to Mexico, there's just so much resentment of him among the kind of business community and even in kind of the mainstream center, I would say. But you point out that in his own way, he's very Trump-like. Explain what you mean.
So there's a similar appeal in the sense that AMLO is very socially conservative. So this is not a president who supports gay rights or abortion. He's made an enemy out of the women's movement, the feminist movement. This is a president who is anti-environment. And this is also a president in Mexico who has little time for democratic niceties. He doesn't care about democratic checks and balances, about transparency, accountability. He frequently attacks the press and columnists and journalists, much the way Trump does. So he has a lot of similarities in governing style and in many ways substance as well.
Does it mean, bottom line, a very different Latin America for the United States and the world to deal with, much less reform-minded, much less democratic, much less open to the international economy?
I think as we look around the world generally, many countries around the world are much less open to the international economy, including the United States. And so here, Latin America is no different. I think as we start seeing industrial policy arise all over the world, we'll start seeing that in many of these nations led by some of these leaders. That said, this is a region that generally has remained open to trade or have been open to ties to the United States. Latin America basically lost out in the globalization of the last 30 years. It did not hook into global supply chains, at least not in the value-added part. They sold raw materials and they bought finished goods, but they didn't get into the manufacturing that so many Asian economies or Eastern European economies got into. For better or for worse, as the United States doubles down on supply chain resilience, as they talk about reshoring and nearshoring, this provides an opening for Latin America.
Shannon, always good to talk to you. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Next on GPS, David Gergen has worked for 4 different presidents. How does he grade this one? I ask him when we come back.